Here's a brief presentation on Kantian and deontological systems. In what follows, I hope that you will be able to get a feel for the different kinds of deontology that exists out there. Ultimately a product of your friend and mine, Mr. Immanuel Kant. Welcome. I'm Doug Borcoman, your instructor and facilitator for this course. Two types of deontologists exist. First, the act deontologists, and second, the rule deontologists. And let's go a little bit with the act deontologists. Remember, the term deontology means the study of one's duty, from the Greek deontos plus logos. In terms of what we call act deontology, where there is a specific focus on a particular act, you can characterize this particular branch of deontological systems thinking in the following way. Each act that you or I do is a unique ethical occasion, and a decision must be made by consulting our conscience and intuition, apart from any specific rules that may apply. So it's kind of situational. And of course, act deontologists can be divided into further groups, if you really like classification schemes: the Intuitionists and the Decisionists. Intuitionists believe that we have to consult with our conscience in every situation to discover the morally right thing to do. So always you'd be asking yourself the question, when it comes to having to make a specific act or perform a certain kind of conduct, you consult your conscience. Whereas a decisionist says that there is no morally right answer until you actually make a choice, until you actually engage in the act itself. And this is typically associated with existentialism, and probably the principal and most common spokesperson, or famous celebrity-type spokesperson, who of course has now passed away, would be Jean-Paul Sartre, famous for, among other things, his book Being and Nothingness. But if you think a little bit about the Intuitionist position on this, it seems to be fairly clear that we certainly should consult our conscience, but the problem is, do we all have a conscience? Decisionists would claim that it's not so much conscience, but that in fact through the participating in the act and making a decision right on the spot, we somehow do our duty, if you will. These two are in contrast with rule deontological theories, and it is the rule deontological form that our friend Mr. Immanuel Kant mostly promoted in his work on morality and ethics. For a rule deontologist, you accept the principle of universalizability, and if you study Kant a little bit, you'll know a little about that, as well as the notion that in making moral judgments we're appealing to principles or rules. So what we try to do rationally as a rule deontologist is come up with a rule or maxim, as Kant expresses it, that will cover all cases. And of course you might guess that with respect to rule deontology there are at least two types: the objectivists and the absolutists. Kant was an absolutist, in the sense in which he believed that once you come to that universal maxim or that categorical imperative, it is true for all and in every circumstance. And insofar as that's true, we have to perhaps reflect just a little bit upon Mr. Kant's background. His parents were pietistic in the sense in which they believed a lot of holiness. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was tremendously influential in terms of his work on human freedom. And, of course, this fits into the debate between rationalism and empiricism, and if you read a little bit more about Kant, you would know that in his Critique of Pure Reason, he attempts to resolve the distinction between rationalism and empiricism. Pietism means that his parents were somewhat into a certain kind of holiness, which is one of the reasons why, when you think about it, it appears as though Kant's attempt to try to universalize certain things like not telling lies to people or following the golden rule is really the rational kind of pietistic notion that comes from biblical understanding, or the Ten Commandments. So we get under rule deontology the categorical imperative. That is the command to perform actions that are necessary of themselves without reference to other ends. This means that there is no other reason for doing or engaging in an act under the categorical imperative rubric except for its own sake. In contrast with hypothetical imperatives, they command you to do actions not for their own sake, but for the sake of some other good, which is why, hypothetically speaking, you always express an imperative that's hypothetical in terms of an if-then. Moral duties are those, and those alone, which are categorical, and they command, rather like a maxim would do, us to do what is right in a universal sense, absolutistically. And, according to Kant, such actions are only done and are morally valuable if done by a good will. So you have to have good intentions, goodwill. You produce an act in accordance with the categorical imperative which you have speculated about being universalizable, and then you have Kantian duty, or deontology. There are basically three formulations. Two of these I hope become rather clear. The third one I think is always a little bit muddied, but we try to put it into ordinary language. There is the principle of ends. Each person has dignity and profound worth. Therefore, people should not be exploited nor manipulated or merely used as a means to an end. So human beings are ends in themselves. That's one of the expressions of the categorical imperative, one formulation of it. Human beings, as rational beings, have value and must be conceived as having unconditional worth. So part of this has to do with a kind of metaphysic about what it means to be a human being, a sentient and sapient entity. That is to say, we have the capacity to feel, and at the same time we also have the capacity to think. And putting those two things together, we come up with the idea of a moral subject, which is in essence what a human being is. So anytime you find a moral subject, there is a demand upon us to treat that being morally. Another principle, the principle of autonomy. Every rational being is able to regard oneself as a maker of universal laws. Now, autonomos is a nice Greek word that means to be self-ruled. And that is another way of saying to be completely self-contained, to come up with your own, according to the principles of logic, moral maxims. You can generate yourself. We determine the nature of moral law, not God or any authority. This isn't to say that Kant was somehow an atheist. He was, as mentioned previously, raised in a family of extreme piety, and probably did very much believe in God, and certainly as a Protestant or Presbyterian, I think he was a Protestant, had a strong belief and committed to the idea of, generally speaking, what we call God, but at the same time didn't believe that that morality should be grounded on simply what God says. That is, not just specifically obedience to God's will, but that there was actually something rather logically transcendent in the idea of the categorical imperative that even went beyond God, per se. Admittedly, probably arguable, probably somewhat controversial, but at least worth bringing up for the sake of further discussion. So we become our own authority, morally speaking. Another way of putting that is, as autonomous agents, nobody can really morally, no other human being at least, can legislate to us what we ought or ought not do. That has to be determined in terms of our own autonomous ability to be able to rationally come to grips with whatever categorical imperative and the maxims that flow therefrom that we arrive at. Although his ethics are fully autonomous, there is a kind of religious dimension to his system, and that comes down to another potential formulation of the categorical imperative, which is that we ought to do good because it's our primary duty to do so. So we should go out and do good, and insofar as we are commanded by law to be morally good, we ought to follow the law. Now, how do you apply some of this stuff? Well, I think that you could probably take the theories that we've studied so far, which would include things such as at least John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, deontology, perhaps some point in the future. For some of us, those of you who have read a little bit in advance might have come to grips with virtue ethics or Aristotelianism or Greek ethics. If you put them all together and apply it to freeway driving, I think you might be able to clearly discern what the issues are. Very briefly, I suspect most of you have been on a freeway when it's been congested. I seem to, unfortunately, have to endure that every single working day of my life, and sometimes it's really miserable, but sometimes it's made even worse by those people who seem to believe that they can act in ways which go beyond the rules. I think that in a Kantian sense, it might be argued that all of us have a duty to abide by the rules and regulations of driving, by the laws of freeway driving. Don't use the carpool lane if there's only one of you in the car unless you have special dispensation because you have a hybrid vehicle, for example, to do so. I find in my experience people crossing the double-double line and going into the carpool lane without having any special capability of doing so, and apparently they regard themselves as special. But, if you put that into a deontological context, you'll realize that the person who drives in that way, in other words, crisscrosses over the lane, doesn't indicate any lane changes, goes into the carpool lane when he or she shouldn't, that person probably could not universalize his or her behavior, because then it would be another way of saying, well, we can all do that. And when you think about it, if we all did exactly what the person who transgresses against those rules and regulations of traffic flow, if we all engaged in that kind of activity, it would be even more chaotic than it already is. I mean, it's actually kind of surprising. Even when you take a look at this picture, it almost looks very orderly and unchaotic. But if any one or so of those people start changing lanes without correcting or indicating, what they're about ready to do with the signal indicator, going into the carpool lane when they shouldn't, then in essence they're taking advantage of the rest of us who are basically deontologically doing our duty. And this is what happens when you decide on a whim, because you believe that it's more important, let us say, for you to get to work than anybody else, that you're willing to violate certain kinds of rules. Well, that's certainly, for the absolutist that Kant is verboten, absolutely forbidden. In much the same way, a utilitarian, I suppose, might argue that it's not in the best interest of the greatest good for the greatest number, via the principle of utility, that one or two or so people violate the basic norm of conduct that it seems to be established and promoted in terms of freeway behavior. But I suppose if you were an individual ethical egoist and also a consequentialist and sort of a mini-utilitarian, you might say, well, it's in my best interest, so I will just use other people, which again would be anti-deontological on Kant's view, in order to achieve my own ends, with a reliance upon the idea that the rest of us are not going to violate, in much the same way as the egoist would, those principles. Because if we all did, then of course the egoist would not be able to serve his or her purposes terribly well, because we would not be pressed into the service of that individual's desires and wants. So if you follow what I'm saying, in essence, you could kind of take freeway traffic as a paradigm case of, or at least a staging ground, and try to apply deontology, utilitarianism, and ultimately Greek ethics. And to put in a final word parenthetically for Greek ethics, how would Aristotle hold forth on this issue? He'd probably say that if we were already built as moral characters with high caliber and rational, that either A, we wouldn't be on the freeway in the first place, ha ha ha, or B, we'd be behaving in such a way that we would honor and respect the other people automatically without thinking about it too much. So there would not be that kind of freeway problem that you can get into when somebody decides that what they're going to do is violate the code of conduct that is not only written but to some extent understood in our daily lives and certainly on the freeway. The freeway might be a paradigm case of how it is that we behave. I'd like you to think about it a little bit more. This has been deliberately short and accelerated a little bit, but I just thought I'd let you warm up the course a wee bit with, I hope, some narrative. Take good care, and I hope all is well. Hope to talk to you.